About the recessions, stagflations in the midst of the threat of stagflations and recessions that threaten the world. So many countries whose economies are safe from economic pressure. The Asian Development Bank sees developing countries in Asia continuing to recover despite the risk of slowdown, including Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Philippines, and Cambodia. Why are some countries strong enough to survive from recessions?
Well, at a time when the world economy is slowing, particularly the US and EU have seen a very sharp slowdown, what we're seeing in Southeast Asia is actually pretty strong growth still. So until the first half of the year, the GDP growth rates in Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam have been very strong. And that's because for two main reasons. One is that domestic demand has been strengthening as the pandemic restrictions have been easing. So that's really helped consumer spending. And another important reason is that because global commodity prices have been rising, particularly for coal and for oil and gas, that has helped the exports of Indonesia and also Malaysia. Palm oil prices have also been high, which is also helping. So what we've seen is that Indonesian exports in August were up 30% year on year. Malaysian exports were up actually almost 50% year on year. So the export sector is also contributing to this very strong performance. And the electronics industry in Vietnam has also been doing very well. Malaysia is also a big exporter of electronics. So all of these factors have been helping Southeast Asia to grow at a pretty strong pace so far this year, even though the world economy is slowing down.
Okay. On the other side, we know the era of high interest rates is experienced by many countries. The Fed will also remain in the hawkish positions to maintain inflation in their country. And how will this impact in many countries in Asia?
What we've seen is that at a global level, higher energy prices for oil and gas have really pushed up inflation, particularly in the US and in Europe. But what we've seen in the Asia region is a more differentiated picture. Some countries still have quite moderate inflation, such as China and Japan, where inflation is between 2 and 3%, so still very low. And then in Southeast Asia, it's, I would say, rising pressures. So we see increasing inflation in Indonesia. The inflation rate has picked up in September to 6%. And also in the Philippines, in Singapore, and also in Malaysia, rising. But it's still at, I would say, relatively moderate levels compared to what we've seen in the US, where inflation recently reached 8 to 9%, and also in Europe, where high energy prices have pushed up inflation. So therefore, the central banks in Southeast Asia, although they have been raising rates, the pace of tightening has been more moderate compared to what we're seeing from the US Fed. And I think the outlook is for more moderate rate hikes in the Southeast Asia region compared to the US.
In other conditions, if other countries reduce imports, it will have a huge impact on other countries that are doing exports, including countries in Asia. How do you see about this condition?
I think it's definitely true that although we have seen quite strong export growth in Southeast Asia during the first 8 months of this year, because of the slowdown that we're seeing in the US and also in the EU, and with the outlook for next year being that the EU is expected to be in recession, the US is also very close to being in recession as well. So we could see that the world economy is facing twin recessions in the US and also in the EU in 2023. In that environment, I think it will affect exports from Asia because the US is still a very important export market, and so is the EU. But there's been quite a big change in the structure of Asian exports in the last 20 years. And one very big change is that now Southeast Asia, ASEAN demand within ASEAN is becoming more and more important. So last year, 20% of total ASEAN exports went to other ASEAN countries. And also China has become an important export market in the last 20 years. So a lot of the export demand is actually coming from other Asian countries. So ASEAN is not anymore so reliant on US and EU compared to 20 years ago. And that's very important for next year because we think that China will grow at a stronger rate. Right now, China is quite weak, but we think next year growth in China will improve, and ASEAN at the moment is quite strong. So I think that will help to make exports from Indonesia, from Malaysia, relatively resilient. But there's no doubt that if the US and EU are going into recession, it will hurt exports from Southeast Asia also. So we should expect to see some slowing down of exports in the next few months.
Okay, but beside of that, we have another problems. Yeah, if we talk about Indonesia, especially, how do you see what the positions of Bank of Indonesia with its monetary policy to also to take a positions to maintain inflations in Indonesia? Should be a Bank of Indonesia aggressively raising interest rates in Indonesia?
I don't see that that's necessary at the moment because what we've seen is that inflation, although it has picked up to 6%, it's still relatively moderate and maybe not that far away from Bank Indonesia's target inflation. So this is quite different to the situation in the US or in the EU, where high energy prices have pushed up inflation in the US to over 8%. In the EU, also very high inflation. So Indonesia's inflation rate is still relatively moderate. And if it can be sustained in that sort of range, then I think although it has been some tightening, perhaps only gradual further tightening will be needed. And one important factor that is helpful for Indonesia is that the Indonesian rupiah has been very resilient to all of these turmoil in foreign exchange markets. If we look at Asian currencies, actually the Indonesian rupiah has performed extremely well. It has depreciated a little bit against the US dollar, but has outperformed many other currencies in Asia compared to, say, the Japanese yen or the South Korean won. The rupiah hasn't really come down that much. And so that is also helpful. It means that Bank Indonesia doesn't have that exchange rate pressure to deal with compared to other countries.
Okay.